And you're listening to Morning Report. An advisor who worked on a scathing justice report says Māori are overrepresented as both victims and offenders of crime, and this needs to change. A report published yesterday by Justice Minister Andrew Little's Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group says racism is embedded in every area of the criminal justice system. The group spoke to hundreds of people across the country to compile the report on what is and what is not working in the system. We can talk with Amua Whaipooti now, a member of the Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. Ata Māori.
Morena, Susie.
So racism embedded at every level here. How does that get cleaned out?
Well, we heard from Māori and non-Māori that racism is in every level of our justice system, and not just our justice system, but our communities and way of doing things. I think what was majorly concerning, it was just the number of stories of how individually and within communities racism was devastating those places, and people have been harmed, victims not feeling like they can reach out and ask for help because they're concerned that their children are going to get taken away, or they might have the state interfering in their personal lives. There was a really clear call, particularly from Māori as well, was let us do what we need to do to look after our communities. Clearing out racism is a question for all of us in New Zealand and what that looks like on every level, but there's clearly a call for change that needs to happen.
So if that involves Māori being able to take charge of their own situation, their own system, essentially a devolution, if you like,
Yes.
of that process, how would that be done so that it was fair for all people who may be captured by the system?
Well, it's one thing. There was definitely a call where we heard that the law is one law for all. And actually, if you're listening to Māori and actually other communities, migrant communities and Pacific communities, said, well, we wish it was one law for all and it applied equally to us. And we know for Māori, and like all colonised countries in the world, the impact on Indigenous people, there are different outcomes for Māori for doing the same thing at every level of our justice system. So I think if we tidy up how do we make a system work for Māori that doesn't come at a disadvantage to everyone, that actually it feeds into the health of how we do justice in New Zealand.
So does there actually need to be a system that is designed for Māori, that is effectively rooted in Te Ao Māori, and that is what is used instead? Everyone.
We have heard that, and we've heard that the year I was born, Mātamoana Jackson, he whai pāngaho, same, that was the exact recommendation that came out of that. We have heard that all around the country. We have heard that in very small communities. I mean, we had one very prominent iwi, I won't single out particularly iwi, but who are taking care of business in their rohi, in their region, and but they're dealing with what I would call quite colonised contracts, actually in the language of what I've heard that be called, colonised contracts, of where they've had young graduate advisors coming up from Wellington, from Justice, going over there to assess whether they're culturally competent and meeting the needs of their contracts. So the resource needs to follow the expertise, and we're seeing pockets of where it's happening in spite of the system or in spite of resource, because there's clear want for change and ownership from Māori around the country to address their communities in whānau.
Because is there any other reason why New Zealand has one of the highest rates of incarceration of its Indigenous people? Is there any other reason other than racism?
Well, more than racism, it's colonisation as well. So racism, and that affects our migrant communities and Pacific communities, but what is known internationally in colonised countries is the incarceration rates of Indigenous people are so disproportionate. And I wish that this was unique. Well, that this was a unique New Zealand experience, because we could fix this up. And we can fix this up, but it's actually replicated in other colonised countries. And the impact of colonisation, people think that's a historical thing, but what that means today, when actively, and we have to own our history in New Zealand, actively we had laws that actively tried to assimilate Māori culture, oppress Māori culture, and because it was seen as a savage culture. We have displacement and theft of land, which actually today counts as an economic base. You have that taken away. And then you have a loss of education and language, which was an active process of our historical governments. What impact would that have on people so many generations on? Well, we know what impact that has. And that's something that we need to own as a country. And I think being honest with that is part of the solution as to how we get past the impacts of colonisation and actually the reality of racism in New Zealand.
So is it now down to the government or to a cross-party consensus, if that can be achieved, to be that brave, to take that on, because it is something which a lot of people find incredibly uncomfortable to look at and to face?
Using the word racism has been very challenging for anyone in a government space to actually own it in our leadership. I mean, it often gets translated into a bias or discrimination, but actually let's own that. I think that there's leadership there. We had Mike Bush, who's the police commissioner, come out a few years and say that, come out and talk about the racism and bias in the system. I do think that many of the solutions are in our communities, around our family tables as well. So we all have ownership, collective ownership around changing the racism in this country. We've seen some devastating, violent impacts, actions of racism. But knowing what racism looks like on the daily in New Zealand, these are the stories that we heard. We hear of women who are in abusive relationships, who are being subject to violence, but to quote someone who I was speaking with, one of the many people we spoke with, the violence at that hand was less violent than coming into contact with the police because they were scared their children might get taken away, or the fact that they have unpaid fines was going to mean that they were going to get in trouble. So you have women who are mostly women who won't go to the state for support or help because they see it as a violent perpetrator in and of itself. That's actually the reality of what we're hearing, and what I know Māori know this already. Yes, we do need to change this, and there's a role for all of us, and a challenge whoever our government of the day is to stop politicking this. It's this isn't a political issue, and if they read the report, they'll see the grief in that report and the call for change. So stop kicking it around like a football, because these are people's lives.
I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much. Amua Whaipooti, member of the Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. It is now 24 minutes to 9.
Time for a business update. Now, Giles, markets, so they bounced over the weekend because the job numbers were bad, but that meant